Did you know that a teenage king, crowned at 14 and ruling a peaceful Christian kingdom, faced the most feared army in Europe at age 29 and chose torture and death over compromising his faith? How does a warrior king refuse to fight, refuse to flee, refuse to share power with pagans, knowing that refusal means being tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, and beheaded like a common criminal? And why has England's greatest martyr king, whose shrine was once as important as Canterbury, whose name gave rise to a major town, who was the patron saint of England for centuries, been almost completely forgotten today? This is the story of Saint Edmund, the young king who ruled with justice, faced Viking invaders with courage, and died with Christ's name on his lips, proving that some crowns are worth dying for, but only one crown is worth dying to keep. Why would a young king choose death over survival? The answer lies in the Viking conquest of East Anglia and a martyr's final stand. Tap like and subscribe for more true stories of courage buried by time. He was only 14 when they placed the crown on his head. The year was 855, and Edmund, born into the royal line of Saxon nobility, became king of East Anglia, ruler of the fertile lands of what we now call Norfolk and Suffolk. Too young, some whispered. But the kingdom needed a king, and Edmund had royal blood. More importantly, he had something rarer than bloodlines: integrity. His reign began in peace and continued in peace. While other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought among themselves, Edmund's East Anglia flourished. Fields yielded abundant harvests. Trade routes buzzed with merchants. Churches rose in villages and towns. The young king walked among his people, not with arrogance, but with attention, listening to disputes, protecting the poor, punishing wickedness without cruelty. He was just. He was merciful. He was devout. Every morning began with Mass. Every decision was filtered through prayer. He studied Scripture not as religious duty, but as living conversation with God. His nobles marveled at his wisdom, too deep for his years, they said. His subjects loved him. They called him blessed. They thanked God for giving them a king who feared the Lord more than he feared men. For 14 years, this peace held. Edmund grew from boy to man, from uncertain youth to confident ruler. He never married, never produced an heir, but poured himself entirely into his sacred trust. He believed, deeply, unshakably, that kingship was not about power, but about service, that the crown on his head was a weight of responsibility to God, that his authority came not from armies or gold, but from the one who placed him on the throne. He had no way of knowing his peaceful reign was ending, that the storm gathering across the sea would test everything he believed, that in less than a year, he would face a choice between his crown and his faith, between his life and his Lord. The year 869 was approaching, and with it, the great heathen army. They came in 865, like a plague of locusts, but far deadlier. The Vikings had raided England's coasts for decades. Swift attacks, stolen treasure, burning monasteries, and then disappearing across the waves. But this was different. This wasn't a raid. This was conquest. The Great Heathen Army, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it. Thousands of warriors under the command of Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. They brought not just weapons, but ambition. To carve up England, to settle permanently, to replace Christian kingdoms with pagan rule. Their ships darkened the horizon. Their war cries froze the blood. They struck Northumbria first. The kingdom fell. York, ancient capital, became a Viking stronghold. Then Mercia crumbled under their assault, its king reduced to a puppet. Kingdom after kingdom collapsed like wheat before the scythe. The Vikings were unstoppable, better organized, brutally efficient, merciless to those who resisted. In 869, they turned their eyes toward East Anglia. Edmund knew they were coming. He'd bought temporary peace years earlier with tribute, hoping they'd pass by. But now they returned, and this time they wanted more than gold. They wanted submission. They wanted his kingdom. They wanted him to bow to pagan overlords. Edmund prepared his forces, but he knew the odds. His army was smaller, less experienced in Viking tactics. When the battle came, somewhere near Hoxne in Suffolk, it was brief and brutal. Edmund's forces were shattered. Men died defending their king, but it wasn't enough. The Vikings won decisively. Edmund survived the battle. Whether he retreated to a stronghold or was captured immediately, the sources disagree. But the outcome was the same. His kingdom was conquered, his army broken, and he stood alone before Ivar the Boneless, the most feared commander in Europe. The fighting was over. Now came something harder than battle: the choice. Ivar's terms were simple. Share power, Edmund could remain king in name, but acknowledge Viking overlordship, provide tribute and hostages, allow Viking warriors to settle in East Anglia, permit pagan worship alongside Christianity, accept the new reality. The alternative was equally simple: death. Not quick death, either. Ivar made that clear. Refusal meant torture designed to break him publicly, to humiliate him, to make an example that would terrify every other Christian ruler into submission. Edmund knew what the Vikings did to those who defied them. He'd heard the stories. He'd seen the burned churches, the murdered priests. By any practical measure, accepting made sense. He could live, preserve some autonomy, protect his people from worse violence. Many would have understood. Many would have chosen survival. But Edmund saw deeper than political calculation. He understood what compromise meant. To share power with pagans was to legitimize pagan authority over Christians. To allow pagan worship was to betray the first commandment. To submit was to declare that earthly crowns mattered more than heavenly ones, that survival trumped faithfulness, that Christ's kingship was negotiable. He'd been raised to believe that kingship came from God, for God's purposes. His authority wasn't his to bargain away. His responsibility wasn't to himself, but to the faith entrusted to his protection. And Christ's own words echoed in his memory: "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet lose his soul?" The calculation was eternal, not temporal. He looked at Ivar, this pagan warlord who thought power came from swords and terror, and spoke clearly, calmly. Finally, "I will never deny Christ. I will never betray my people to pagans. Do what you will. My soul belongs to God, not to you." Ivar's face darkened with fury. This defiance, this refusal to bend, enraged him more than any battlefield defeat. He'd expected a practical king, a politician who'd choose survival. Instead, he faced a martyr. "You'll regret those words," Ivar snarled. Edmund's response was steady as stone. "I regret nothing done for Christ." They dragged him away to prepare his execution. But it wouldn't be quick. It would be designed to break him, to make him recant, to prove that everyone breaks eventually. They didn't understand. Edmund had already made his choice, and martyrs don't break. November 20, 869. They brought him to a clearing, stripped him, and tied him to a tree. The same pagans who worship trees now used one as an instrument of torture. The irony was lost on them. Edmund saw it clearly. He'd be bound to wood, like Christ to the cross. First came the scourging. Whips and rods tore his flesh. They wanted screams, pleas for mercy, cries of recantation. They got prayers. Edmund's lips moved constantly, calling on Jesus, asking for strength, forgiving his torturers. The more they beat him, the louder he prayed. Then they tied him tighter to the tree, arms spread, body exposed. And the Vikings, expert archers, began using him as target practice. Arrow after arrow pierced his flesh, arms, legs, torso. They aimed deliberately, avoiding immediately fatal wounds, prolonging the agony. Medieval accounts say he looked like a hedgehog, bristling with arrows. Each impact brought new waves of pain. Blood soaked the ground beneath him. But Edmund didn't curse, didn't deny, didn't beg them to stop. Instead, with each arrow, his voice rose clearer. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. They couldn't break him. This young king, barely 30 years old, tied to a tree and shot full of arrows, proved stronger than their cruelty. His faith outlasted their fury. His endurance mocked their attempts at intimidation. Finally, enraged by his refusal to break, Ivar gave the order. An executioner stepped forward with an axe. One brutal swing severed Edmund's head from his body. They'd silenced his voice. But not his witness. His last word, witnesses reported, was Jesus. A prayer, a proclamation, a victory cry. The Vikings threw his head into the nearby woods, left his body where it fell, and moved on to consolidate their conquest. They thought they'd eliminated Christian resistance. They'd killed their political enemy, made their brutal example, but they'd made a mistake. They'd created a martyr, and martyrs are more dangerous dead than alive. For 34 years, Edmund's body lay buried at Hoxne, hidden from Viking desecration. His people, terrified but faithful, had secretly retrieved his remains, including his head, which legend says was guarded by a wolf until they found it, and given him a Christian burial. Then in 903, when the Vikings had been pushed back and East Anglia recovered, someone decided Edmund deserved better than a hidden grave. They would move him to a proper shrine, give him the honor denied at his death. They opened the grave expecting bones. What they found stopped them cold. Edmund's body was incorrupt, 34 years in the ground, and his flesh hadn't decayed. The wound where his head was severed had healed. He looked, witnesses said, like he was sleeping. In medieval understanding, this was God's seal of approval, heaven's confirmation that this was no ordinary man but a saint, a martyr whose faithfulness had earned eternal glory. They carried him in solemn procession to Biographies, a small village in central Suffolk. They built a church for his relics. Pilgrims began coming. Miracles were reported, healings, protections, and answers to prayers. The village grew into a town, renamed for the saint whose body rested there, the Martyr King, Saint Edmund's. For 600 years, Edmund's shrine was one of England's most important pilgrimage sites. Kings came to pray at his tomb. The abbey, built around his relics, became one of the richest in England. His feast day, Nov.20, was celebrated across the nation. He was England's patron saint, the martyred king who proved that faithfulness to Christ mattered more than earthly power. Churches were dedicated to him. His image appeared in stained glass and paintings, crowned king holding arrows, symbol of his martyrdom. Children learned his story. Everyone knew Edmund, the young king who chose death over denial, whose body God preserved to prove that martyrs never truly die. Then came the Reformation, and everything changed. The year was 1539. Henry VIII's commissioners arrived at Bury St. Edmund's Abbey with orders to dissolve the monastery, seize its wealth, and destroy what they called superstitious idolatry. The monks were expelled. The buildings were stripped, and Edmund's shrine, 6 centuries of continuous veneration, was demolished. What happened to his incorrupt body? Nobody knows. Some say Protestant reformers burned it. Others claim faithful monks hid it so well it's never been found. Most likely, it was destroyed in the systematic campaign against Catholic relics. The physical remains of England's martyr king vanished. But worse than losing the relics was losing the memory. Protestant England rejected saint veneration as popish superstition. Edmund's feast day disappeared from official calendars. His churches were rededicated or their dedications ignored. His role as England's patron saint was given to Street George, more acceptable to post-Reformation sensibilities. For 400 years, Edmund was almost completely forgotten. The abbey where pilgrims once flocked became romantic ruins. The town kept his name, but forgot why. England lost connection to the martyr king who'd chosen faith over power, who died calling Christ's name, who'd been so important that an entire town grew around his tomb. By the 20th century, Edmund was known mainly to medievalists and church historians. The average English person had never heard of him. Children learned about St. George slaying dragons, but nothing about Edmund facing Vikings. The shrine that once rivaled Canterbury was reduced to crumbling walls, visited by tourists who didn't know the story. Only recently has interest revived. Anglican churches began reclaiming pre-Reformation English saints. Catholic communities rediscovered their heritage. Historians reassessed Anglo-Saxon England. Nov.20 reappeared on some church calendars. Berry Street, Edmunds embraced its patron saint again, at least for tourism. But Edmund remains largely forgotten. Ask random English people about their greatest saint king, and few will know his name. The medieval patron of England is now an obscure historical footnote. Yet forgotten by men doesn't mean forgotten by God, and Edmund's message matters more, not less, as time passes. Why remember a 9th century king martyred by Vikings? Because his story never gets old. Because the choice he faced, compromise or suffer, is eternal. Because every generation needs to hear that some things can't be negotiated, that Christ is worth dying for, that earthly crowns are temporary, but martyrs' crowns last forever. Edmund was 29 when he died, young by any measure. He could have lived decades more, ruled in peace under Viking overlordship, and preserved his dynasty. But he understood what we forget, that life itself isn't the highest good, that survival at the cost of faithfulness is the worst death, that losing everything for Christ is the only way to keep what matters. For Christians under persecution today, and they exist, millions of them, in places where confessing Christ means losing jobs, homes, freedom, or life, Edmund stands as a witness. Your martyrdom matters. Your faithfulness outlasts your torturers. Your blood, like his, is seed for the church. For leaders tempted to compromise principle for power, Edmund's example is clear. Choose rightly. The approval of pagans means nothing. The wrath of tyrants is temporary. But God's judgment is eternal. For young people wondering if faith requires heroic virtue they don't possess, Edmund was 14 when crowned, 29 when martyred. Age doesn't determine courage. Grace makes heroes of ordinary people. For nations that forget their martyrs, look at England. Once unified around Edmund's witness, now barely remembering him. Loss of memory weakens identity. Forgetting costs more than we realize. The Vikings who killed Edmund thought they'd won. They conquered his kingdom, destroyed his army, and silenced his voice. But where are they now? Gone, converted, or disappeared. Their victory lasted decades. Edmund's victory is eternal. They tied him to a tree, but he became more like Christ. They shot him with arrows, but each one was a seed of resurrection. They cut off his head, but his witness grew louder in death than it ever was in life. They tied him to a tree, but he became more like Christ. They shot him with arrows, but each one was a seed of resurrection. They cut off his head, but his witness grew louder in death than it ever was in life. Saint Edmund, the boy who became king, the king who became martyr, the martyr who became forgotten. Pray for us. Teach us that crowns are worthless if purchased with betrayal. Show us that losing everything for Christ is the only mathematics that makes sense eternally. You were 29 when the Vikings killed you. Your courage is older than time. England forgot its martyr king, but heaven never forgets. And neither should we.